Good evening. My name's Amy McDonald. I run this place. How many people, this is your first time here? Wow. Okay. Tom Perrotta fans. How many people saw Election when it came out? How many are staying to watch it again? Yeah, it'll be fun. This is the last event that we have in our fiscal year. Then we'll start. We have a few in the summer, and then we'll be going full speed ahead in September. Visit our website, wbur.org/events. Come back to this gorgeous space. We do everything. We do author interviews. We do movies. We do food. We do panels on policy. And it's just a great space. And so I welcome you back. I'm really proud to have Tom Perrotta here to talk about Tracy Flick Can't Win, the follow-up to Election. It's going to be a great conversation. Tom and I are old friends, so it's wonderful to have him here. Interviewing him tonight is Emiko, who is, I call her, probably the most literary person at WBUR. She is a voracious reader, and she does a great interview. Welcome, Emiko and Tom.
The great thing is that since so many people here have seen Election, we don't have to say, okay, now who is Tracy Flick? But you kind of have to start with the really, really obvious question, which is, why Tracy Flick now? What prompted you to say, okay, this is the time for a sequel?
I think the truth is that I didn't even know that it was until it was underway, which is probably the only way I would have done it. So a few years ago, Paramount, which made Election, started talking about maybe doing some kind of updated reboot, like the way they did with the Wonder Years. Mm-hmm. We'll do like Election, but in 2015 or whatever. And that didn't interest me at all. But I think it did sort of plant a little seed, like, what would be a way to take the characters in Election and do something interesting. But I've never done that before, and I just put it out of my mind. And I started to write a book about a former professional football player who goes back to his hometown. He's been inducted into the school's new Hall of Fame. And he's having neurological problems related to brain injuries from football. And he goes back to be celebrated, but actually there are all these people there who remember what a jerk he was and have unfinished business with him. And it seemed like such a cool way to sum up the state of masculinity in America right now. Like, we had our glory days, and now there's the reckoning, And that is a part of this book. But when I started to write the story of this football player, I started to naturally do it in the style of Election, which is with these multiple first-person narrators. And it felt weird to me because I felt like I was maybe like plagiarizing my own work. And I didn't know why I was doing it. And then one day, I just said, is Tracy here? And as soon as I said it, the answer was yes. Tracy's here. She's still in high school. Because she's doomed to live out her fate, which is to fight to get up the next rung in high school.
I mean, that's what's so interesting because, the Tracy that we met in Election was sort of on the cusp of greatness. She had done everything right. She was all set to become president, and then other stuff happens, and she has this derailment. And then when we meet her in Tracy Flick Can't Win, that event still has shaped her life. That's what's so. Those things that happen in high school sometimes follow us.
That has been my experience. I used to laugh, when I was in college and we were studying Freud, and they'd say, your life is determined by what happens to you between the ages of like 0 and 3. Like everything you need to know about a person comes from those early childhood years. And that just seemed wrong to me. But if you said to me, you are the product of everything that happened to you between ages 13 and 17, I would believe you. That seems like a viable theory to me. And I think even Tracy doesn't fully understand. Tracy is the assistant principal at this school that's bringing back this football player for the Hall of Fame. And the principal has retired, so she sees a sudden opening for herself to become the principal. And so, of course, and she deserves it. She's served the school really well.
She has a PhD.
She has a PhD. Everybody, when they need a job done in the school, they go to Tracy. But this event of going for the principal job and the combination, when you say why now, it's the moment of Me Too. And if you've seen the movie Election or read the book, you know that Tracy has a brief affair with her high school English teacher. And in the book and in the movie, as you'll see again, she's pretty defiant about it. She presents herself as a person with agency, a person who made a choice. She made a choice to start the relationship. She realized it was a mistake. She made the choice to stop it. And she says, you know, that's all it was. It was a brief thing. It didn't mean anything. I was in control of it. And just let me get on with my life, is her attitude in Election. But now, something about the combination of this Me Too moment and striving for this job, bringing back memories from high school. And you realize just how shaken she was by this idea that this teacher who she liked and respected went to such great lengths to ruin her dream.
I mean, that's what is so interesting in this book, because if you go back to those events in Election that, you know, feel like they just, in a way, I mean, they have impact. But you feel like, okay, they go by and you grow up and you go by. But Tracy has, I mean, she was deeply wounded by what happened. I mean, that's something that she can't quite get beyond. That this teacher tried to destroy her big dream.
Right, and the teacher was caught, and she does become president, but
Hollow.
It's hollow. It's a hollow victory, and it kind of sets the tone for her life. Like you can get what you want, but it might not feel right. And there's something sort of devastating about that. And you could say the same probably about that sexual experience that she had. You know, though she's defiant about it, there's some way in which that also sets a tone for her life. Like, I thought I wanted that, but that wasn't what I wanted.
Yeah, because, you know, Tracy is also reading all these Me Too reports and starting to sort of revisit that time and think about it. But one thing I also wanted to talk a little bit about is sort of why Tracy is in the position that she is in. Because, you know, she was all set for this big career. She was going to go to Georgetown. She was going to go to law school. She was going to, you know, maybe become a senator, run for president. I mean, she was going to have huge things happen to her, and they didn't. And the reason why they didn't is something that I think happens to a lot of people, also a lot of women. Your life sidetracks you somehow.
Yeah, so one of the challenges of writing this book was, you know, I start just feeling like, oh, I see Tracy. She's at this school. What's she doing at this school? And so I have to kind of backfill once I decide, okay, Tracy is the assistant principal at this school. How did Tracy end up an assistant principal? She had bigger goals in mind. And the story that, you know, it's funny, I can say the story I came up with, the story I discovered is what it feels like, is that her mother got sick. And I won't go into all the details, they're in the book, but the one thing that when I went back and reread Election, I just thought Tracy's relationship with her mother is the most important thing in her life. And she had to leave law school to help care for her mother, and she wasn't able to work full time because of the caring, and so she became a substitute teacher. And then slowly they liked her at school, they brought her on, she started to go to night school. She's still Tracy, she's still doing superhuman things, but within a context of being a caretaker, which doesn't really come naturally to her, and didn't come naturally to her mother, who was really the visionary for Tracy's ambition. Tracy was always ambitious on her mother's behalf. Like, her mother was like, you go out and you do everything that I couldn't do. And she took this in and made it her mission in life. And then she gave it up for the one person who loved her. And I think she's also coming to terms with the meaning of that in the course of this book.
I just want to backtrack because we've sort of gone to, what Tracy became, but the Tracy you created originally has sort of become a symbol beyond what you wrote in a way. I mean, part of it is also, the incredible Reese Witherspoon, her performance in the film, but she, this young, ambitious woman has sort of become a symbol of something beyond the book almost.
Yeah, and I think that it happened because Tracy was a representative of this first generation of girls who were raised by feminist moms and sometimes feminist dads who told them that they could do anything. And by the way, a generation post Roe versus Wade, Tracy, like a lot of women I taught when I was teaching college in the late 80s and early 90s, truly felt like there was going to be a woman president and it could possibly be me. And I am focusing my life like a laser beam on achieving these goals, and I'm going to seize this power that's now available to me. And when the book and the movie came out, it turned out that there weren't actually a lot of stories about women who were ambitious on their own behalf in a professional way. There were, we're used to the Lady Macbeths who are ambitious for their husbands. We're used to the Edith Wharton characters who are ambitious to marry, or Jane Austen characters who are ambitious to marry well. But this idea of like, I am going to conquer. I guess Mary Tyler Moore was a little bit of a proto one, but the great thing about Mary Tyler Moore, or the distinctive thing, was that she was a charming and insecure and vulnerable person, even while she was trying to live independently and sort of forge a new path. Tracy is a much harder edged, slightly blinkered figure, and to the point where she scares some of the adult men who encounter her when she's young.
Speaking of people who scared adult men, we have an audience question. How did you feel when Hillary Clinton was referred to as a Tracy Flick when she was running for president, and was not a compliment?
Yeah, well, it was a strange experience for me as a fiction writer. At first I was flattered because characters don't often escape the pages of a book and make their way into cultural conversation. And I do think that it was not a compliment. I think people just thought Tracy was a grind, that Tracy was abrasive, that Tracy was Machiavellian, so that all of these things were being projected onto Hillary Clinton when that was used. But one of the interesting things that happened around that same time was that I think feminist critics, Rebecca Traister among them, started to push back against this idea that Tracy was unworthy or unlikable. She's just like, wait a second, why is Tracy Flick the villain of this story? Tracy Flick is a 16-year-old girl with a lot of good qualities who's trying to get elected president of her high school so she can get a scholarship and go to college because she's got a single mom who can't afford to send her there. Yes, Tracy rips up some posters in a fit of anger and lies about it to her teacher. That's the extent of Tracy's wrongdoing. I guess Mr. M would add that she somehow destroyed his friend, who's the teacher who had the affair with her. But I think from our perspective now, that's insane. That somehow the 16-year-old girl is being seen as the villain in this affair that ended a teacher's career. So I do think it has been both a little demoralizing to see my character become a kind of sexist trope, but then, somewhat encouraging to see her redefined as the figure that she is, which is an imperfect, determined, resilient, very ambitious young woman who, who may not be the most likable person in the world, but, most ambitious people are actually probably not that likable.
And incidentally won the election. Yes. That was, but the Tracy we meet in Tracy Flick Can't Win, you see all the layers. You see the hurt. You see there's still the ambition there. There's still the need to do the good job. To do, and that's what's so, you start to see more lovable qualities about her. I mean, maybe they were there before, but you really start to see them in a clearer light.
Well, I think there seem to be some middle-aged people in the crowd. I'm in that space myself, and if you go to your high school reunion, you see people who are, parts of them are strange to you, but there's often a core of the person that has persisted over the years. And I think the sadness that you were referring to is partly a middle-aged state, right? It's like what Mr. M reacts to in election is Tracy's potential, which seems greater than his own. His own life is what it is. It is, he's a teacher and he's a good one, but he wanted a little more for himself. He feels like a lot of us do in middle age of, this wasn't exactly what I expected. And Tracy's just pure potential. And that's her power. That's what's threatening to him, is her potential. But now we're seeing Tracy in Mr. M's position. It's like her unlimited potential is now a very specific and limited reality that she has to live within. And her expectations for herself were so high that even her perfectly successful and respectable life seems small to her.
I mean, yeah, she got a PhD. She has a good job. She owns property. I mean, she gets out of a relationship because it's not the right one for her. I mean, she has agency now, and that is a good thing to see. But I have to ask you about this title, because Tracy Flick Can't Win, which incidentally kind of reminded me of election. Tracy Flick Can't Win. But it seems to have a lot of different layers to it. I mean, what does it say to you?
Well, I think a title, election's a very, it seems a very bland title, but of course it also has elements of choice. I elected to do that. Mr. M makes some terrible choices. It also has that sort of Calvinist sense that some people are chosen, that they're predestined. Tracy Flick Can't Win has the feeling of, that's what we say when we're having a bad day or a bad week, right? I can't win. Like I had this thing happen to me and I had that thing happen to me. But I think the deeper meaning there is what Tracy is starting to recognize, because her life is repeating itself a little bit. Like what seemed like a very personal thing that happened to her in high school. This teacher resented her for a specific reason and did everything he could to basically break her spirit. now she's going after this job that she should have. She's by far the most qualified person, and yet forces keep arraying themselves against her. It doesn't seem so personal. It seems systemic. It's like Tracy has hit some kind of glass ceiling. She keeps applying for principal jobs and can't get them. And she's almost starting to see this as a kind of existential thesis. Tracy Flick can't win. Tracy Flick won't be permitted to win. And it does also bring up echoes of Hillary Clinton, I would say. And whenever there's an election, there's that discussion: who can win? We've got to nominate a person who can win. And unless we believe that Tracy can win, unless Tracy believes that she can win, she can't win. And unless I think this will be an interesting question: when will we get a woman president? When will we believe that a woman can win? So I do think it goes from a very personal, Tracy's struggling with her life to there's something in the system that makes it impossible for Tracy to win.
Another thing about Tracy in this book is that she is a mother. She has a child, and we have an audience member who wants to know, how do you see Tracy Flick as a mother in the book? I mean, is she as ambitious for her child as her single mother was for her?
So the answer to that is a definite no. Tracy had an affair with a graduate school teacher who was briefly separated from his wife, and she thought that she would have an abortion, but her mother convinced her that being a single mother was a really rewarding thing. And I think her mother was worried because the mother's health was bad. She thought, you need someone to love, really. And Tracy, in a way, again, was serving her mom, fulfilling her mom's desires for her life. But she shares custody with the old professor, who's a good guy, and he's back with his wife. And they're almost like grandparents, but they raise the daughter for a week, and then Tracy takes her for a week. So she has, I think, what turns out to be a pretty good setup for Tracy. She says, I like being a mom, but I also really like being alone when I can just do my work and not have to cook for anybody. Some part of Tracy is a loner, I think. And she says, like, when she was with her mom, they did everything together, and sometimes got on each other's nerves, but they didn't know where one started and the other left off. And she says, that's not the case with my daughter. Her daughter's an athlete, and she's a very sunny personality, and she has lots of friends. Tracy barely recognizes her as her daughter.
I think every once in a while there's almost a wistfulness there that, I don't quite have that thing. We're not the same team that my mother and I were. Every once in a while, there seems to be a little bit of regret that it's not quite the same relationship she had.
Yeah, even though I think she's starting to wonder about her relationship with her mother and how much a lot of choices that she thought were her own were actually kind of programmed by her mother. That her mother was the one who stoked her ambition from the very beginning, and her mother who, I wouldn't say she made her love dependent on Tracy's success, but Tracy felt that way, that my mother expects so much of me, I have to deliver it because she loves me and she's the one person who I have. And I think, this is a book about a middle-aged person kind of taking inventory. And I think one of the things Tracy is trying to figure out is, how should I remember my mother, and how should I understand that relationship? And should I be that kind of mother, or should I be a different kind of mother?
Election, of course, is the first, of your books to be adapted into film. In fact, it was, sold as, it sort of became the film, and then everyone got interested in the book. Since then, of course, there's been Little Children. There's been The Leftovers, there's been Mrs. Fletcher. I mean, you've had all of these various adaptations in a collaborative medium, in film or in television. and in some cases, like The Leftovers and Mrs. Fletcher, you've had an active hand in adapting your material. And so we have an audience question, how has your own writing process changed now that you've written for these other mediums?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit counterintuitive. I think some people would say, oh, you have become, maybe you're writing your fiction with an eye to it becoming a film and maybe making different choices. But actually what I've really come to see is that screenwriting is such a strict form. There's a set length, and obviously the descriptions have to be very terse, and you can't really, unless you do voiceover, which Election does wonderfully, by the way, you can't really get in a character's head. You just have to judge them based on their actions and expressions. And it's hard to move fluidly through time. But these are all tools that fiction writers can do very easily. It's just so amazing. You can just do flashbacks within flashbacks, just, a week earlier, or, she remembered her sophomore year of high, and you can just move so quickly and get at the layers of somebody's life. And so not having those tools available when I am a screenwriter made me really appreciate them as a fiction writer. And I found that I was maybe becoming a little more literary, in quotes, because I could.
You're like, oh, thank goodness, now I can go back and do these literary devices that I couldn't do when I was adapting.
Bring on the flashbacks.
Another question we have, though, is between Election and now, you have children, and your own children went through high school. So did your experience as a parent of teenagers change the way that you depict kids?
Yeah, so the big difference, when I wrote Election, I was in my early 30s, and I still remembered my high school self very clearly, and so I was drawing on my own youthful experiences. But once you're a parent, and decades go by, my sense of what it's like to be a teenager now comes from observing them. And it gets harder. The world has changed so dramatically. This is part of the reason for writing this book. A lot of the life of American teenagers happens in online spaces that I do not understand. And so I have to have my kids sometimes explain it. And, there's one of the characters who's a little bit of an echo of Tracy. Her name is Lily Chu. She's the vice president of the student council, and way more qualified than the male president, which Tracy kind of recognizes her as a sort of doppelganger in that way. Lily has a romance with a non-binary person, and she is able to kind of navigate that space the way that my kids do. And I still remember what it was like when, they started to explain, like, oh, well, so-and-so is a they now. And, and my wife and I might resist that because it didn't make grammatical sense. And slowly, and the kids were just so scornful of our inability to rewire our brains. And so also in this book, when they are trying to pick people for the Hall of Fame, there's a recent alum who does ASMR.
Right.
She does these sort of whispered makeup tutorials online, and gets hundreds of thousands of people who watch them. And so I was having fun with even just the way that ideas of fame have changed.
Yeah, because her fame is, she's got this huge internet following. Then you have this former football player who has huge fame from a really short career. But
he won the championship back in 1992.
You had a lot of fun with that idea of fame, or what sort of people remember.
Yeah, and Tracy's on the committee voting people into the Hall of Fame, and she's very opposed to the ASMR artist because she just doesn't think this is going to be the first woman we bring into this Hall of Fame. It's somebody who does makeup tutorials in a whispered voice. It just is the opposite of, Tracy, who wants to be, a strong-voiced politician and is not a super feminine person, and I think she just feels like this is a step backwards, to be famous for whispering to an imaginary person how pretty they would be if they used this particular eyelash brush or whatever.
Oh, so did you watch various things? Did you do research on that and watch various odd videos online?
Hours and hours.
It's all research, right?
It's very compelling. You have to whisper, you can scratch, you can crumple paper.
Hypnotic.
Apparently, it stimulates a part of the brain that some people find incredibly pleasurable.
Okay.
Who finds it incredibly pleasurable? Show of hands? Oh, one, okay.
What I think is also when I think about Tracy, and I also think of, Sarah, I believe her name is, in Little Children, I think Mrs. Fletcher. You have a way of sort of delving into the minds of women. Can I ask sort of what draws you, or what you draw from in order to sort of explore their world? Yeah,
that's a long and complicated question. No, it really is. I started out, my first two books were about young men in New Jersey, and I was kind of pigeonholed as I was the American Nick Hornby, and it was called, there'd be a table at the bookstore called Lad Lit. And I wanted to write bigger stories than that. And Election was the first book where I had, I needed to go into the minds of several different characters. And so I had Tracy and Tammy were really the first two women girl narrators that I had written. And I was really nervous about it, not in the way that writers can be nervous now when people are like, you have to stay in your lane, you shouldn't write across boundaries. It wasn't so much that, it was more, did I have the skill as a writer to make these characters seem as real and vivid as the male characters? And what happened was, of course, that I had a really lovely experience with that, where, I wrote Tracy, and ever since I've had women come up to me and just go I was Tracy. And there was some feel, and they say it not with oh, Tracy's, I was awful. What they meant was, I was that girl with my hand in the air. I had big hopes and dreams, and I worked really hard, and, maybe that was slightly ridiculous, but that was who I needed to be at that time. And that was, I think a lot of girls who were ambitious felt like they had to, outshine the boys around them, because it was hard to be taken seriously. And that's another Hillary Clinton kind of quality that a lot of men found threatening or unlikable, in quotes. But once I realized, okay, I'm writing, and people said it was Sarah as well, in Little Children, and I felt like, I guess I am able to write women characters well, and so I just got more and more interested. I was of a particular generation, again, like the women I went to college with, saw their own lives, I remember these optimistic conversations, it's going to be a 50-50 marriage, and my husband is going to take care of the children, and there has been huge changes over time. Men are better fathers, I think, than maybe our own fathers were. My father once said, I changed one diaper and it wasn't for me. And I was just reading this biography of Sylvia Plath, and Ted Hughes was actually unique among his friends for splitting some childcare with her for a brief period before he left, and left her with the kids. But I just remember very optimistic, slightly utopian college conversations about how our generation was going to reinvent marriage and career and family. And I do think, some positive changes were made, but I think a lot of women discovered that this utopian new dispensation that they dreamed of. didn't actually happen. That their husbands weren't quite as helpful as they expected them to be, or that the husband was much more committed to career, or that economics, made it important for one parent to stay home, and it would be that. I think that redefinition of gender and family that has really marked my entire adult life has been my subject. And I've explored it through a lot of these women characters, but there have always been corresponding male characters. In Little Children, there's also a stay-at-home dad who is worried that that his masculinity is tarnished, and so he starts playing in this nighttime, like, violent football league, and just really trying to shore up his sense of himself as a man. And the affair really is about him kind of reclaiming his potency, because his wife is the breadwinner in the family, and he feels a little diminished by that. I just feel like, feminism and the challenges it has posed to men, like that cluster of issues, is really at the heart of all of my work.
And it's not like it's a subject that doesn't keep evolving and developing, and
or regressing.
Yes, well, we're going there too. Why don't we move on to, because we have another audience question. They were saying that, the thing about writing a sequel, hey, and putting Tracy Flick on as part of the title, Election was such a successful work. It became a great movie, and everyone will get to see it again. But so there's so much pressure there. Why bother? Why go there?
Yeah, I think I mentioned before, that this story is taking place in the Me Too moment, and I do think that when that moment happened, I think, like a lot of men, I had to go back and think through, my personal relationships, but I also had this other layer of having to think through it as a writer, and to say, like, I write a lot about these sort of illicit relationships, and I wanted, and I thought, boy, did I go too far in, having Tracy be so unapologetic and so defiant about her choice, and it seemed important to think, and I was just so aware of how, like, cultural lenses change how we interpret our experience, because I do think Tracy was a kind of she was somebody who was plugged into a certain current in feminism at that time, which I sort of think of as, like, Madonna is the godmother of it. It was a very, like, unapologetically ambitious, women can behave like men and get everything they want. They don't have to apologize, and they just go out and do it. And Tracy liked that, because I think it felt empowering to her. And this idea that she was a victim of an older man who had taken advantage of her was the opposite of empowering for her. And I think when I reread Election, I thought, that's what's going on here, is that she just doesn't want to see, in a sense, that she was victimized by this teacher. She would rather see herself as the person in charge. And part of Tracy Flick Can't Win is her re-examining that narrative. Because I think a lot of people had to re-examine narratives. Some people knew, when you read these Me Too stories, especially about teachers who had multiple affairs with students over decades, sometimes some of the girls would say, it ruined my life right then. I dropped out of school. I had all kinds of psychological disturbances. But other women would say, it seemed like like an okay relationship. I left for college and I never saw him again, but he was always like somebody I thought of fondly. But now I look back and I have kids of my own, and it's like, that doesn't seem right anymore. And so there was this element of revisiting the past that I think was happening to a lot of people at that Me Too moment. And I was, as a writer, it seemed worthwhile to go back and revisit Tracy and watch Tracy look at her past through this lens that she didn't have access to in 1992.
I mean, a lot of your work, as you say, is you wrestling with the cultural moment. So is there a particular thing that you want to sort of explore in your work to come? Or is that something you know, or is it all too precious to talk about?
No, I think one way for me to look at it is that I've always sort of followed. I'm not an autobiographical writer by any means. I write from a lot of different perspectives, and I'm as far from an autofictionist as you can get. But I do follow the stages of my life. So Little Children really was written, after I'd spent 6 or 7 years, with taking little kids to playgrounds and, living in that strange bubble that young parents live in. And that came from that. And then you can watch from Abstinence Teacher to The Leftovers to Mrs. Fletcher, like, oh, now these kids are, they're playing soccer and he's, this guy's coaching the team and, now there's an empty nest novel in Mrs. Fletcher. So I have been following my life broadly speaking, but then there have been these cultural issues that have been obsessions of mine. So there's a period that's the Abstinence Teacher and The Leftovers where I was just extremely interested in religion. And that culture war between evangelical Christians and secular liberals. That was Abstinence Teacher, and then in the course of spending a lot of time thinking about evangelical Christianity, I got really interested in the idea of the rapture, and that sort of led me into the space of The Leftovers. And then, of course, I ever since I got my dial-up modem, the pervasiveness of internet porn and the power of internet porn was something that I knew I was going to write about, because it was just, again, I grew up in the old days where you had to get a magazine, which, and then suddenly it was ubiquitous, and I just thought, thank God I'm not a kid now, and because I remember that even as a teenager in the 70s, there was something illicit and powerful about porn that I, knew I had to stay away from in a way, but then suddenly with the internet, it was hard to stay away. And I just wanted to think about how it could affect different people in different ways. So that was, I just have different obsessions at different times as a writer, and I try to follow those. But what I'm working on now is, it may just be a time of life where I'm feeling retrospective. So I revisited Tracy and Tracy Flick Can't Win, and now I'm kind of revisiting the 70s of my childhood in New Jersey. And part of that was just watching, I think, January 6th and seeing a lot of people who reminded me of people I went to high school with, and thinking about the way that world felt a little unhinged. The 70s were crazier than, now they're made into a nostalgic period, but post-Vietnam, there was a lot of weird conspiracy thinking in the air back then. And I was just trying to look back at the 70s and try and see if there were, traces of what has really come to fruition in a dark way more recently.
Well, we really cannot wait to see what you come up with. Tom Perrotta, and the book is Tracy Flick Can't Win. So definitely, if you have not read it yet, definitely go out and read it. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Emiko. This was great. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Enjoy the movie.